The unthinkable act that shook the Galactic Council. The Galactic Council's Grand Chamber was an architectural marvel, a circular coliseum of diplomacy where the most powerful species in the known universe debated and decided the fate of entire civilizations. The walls shimmered with pulsating energy conduits, displaying intricate holograms of interstellar maps, economic reports, and diplomatic treaties. Delegates from 100 worlds filled the amphitheater, their distinct alien features reflecting millennia of evolutionary divergence. Some were reptilian, others bore translucent skin, while a few levitated instead of walking. Today, however, their collective attention was fixed on a single species, humans. For centuries, humanity had been seen as an oddity in the galactic sphere, intelligent, resourceful, but ultimately fragile. Their homeworld, Earth, was classified as a borderline death world, yet they lacked the biological resilience of true apex predators like the Cathar, the 10-foot-tall hunting beasts of the Zarn Dominion, or the Drazian stalkers, whose mandibles could crush steel. Humans had no venom, no natural armor, no superior senses. Their only advantage, if one could call it that, was persistence, a terrifying ability to adapt and overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. It was that very adaptability that led to the current crisis unfolding in the chamber. A human, David Harris, a representative of the Terran delegation, had done the impossible. He had walked up to the apex predator of the galaxy and petted it. The Cathar, an enormous dragon-like creature with pearlescent scales, a ridge of glowing spines along its back, and piercing electric blue eyes, was considered untamable. Even the Zarn, a species that had bred Cathar for war for thousands of years, only managed to control them through strict obedience training, fear, and a system of electroneural dampeners embedded in their skulls. A Cathar did not recognize kindness. It recognized dominance or prey. And yet, this human, with nothing but an outstretched hand, had managed to do what no species had ever dared. The chamber was utterly silent, save for the deep, reverberating growl of the Cathar, Zephyr. The beast's clawed feet were dug into the metallic flooring, its long, whip-like tail curled as if prepared to strike. The last time a diplomat had stood this close to a Cathar, it had ended in a diplomatic incident and an emergency funeral. And yet, the unthinkable happened. Zephyr's growl faded. The powerful muscles beneath its armor-like hide relaxed. Its eyes, sharp as a plasma cutter, studied the human. And then, slowly, impossibly, the creature lowered its head. David Harris grinned, his fingers running along the smooth, scaled snout of the beast. There, big guy," he murmured, his voice calm and unshaken. "You're not so bad, are you?" The collective gasp from the council members was almost deafening. A human had just domesticated a Cathar, with nothing but a gentle touch. The reaction of the galactic elite. Councillor Zaru, the Zarn diplomat, stood frozen, his bioluminescent scales shifting rapidly between deep purples and alarmed oranges, a clear sign of absolute panic. "Human," Zaru hissed, his four-clawed fingers tightening around the edge of his podium. You just pet a Cathar. Do you have any idea what you've done?" David, still stroking Zephyr's snout, glanced up with an amused expression. "What? You said they were intelligent. I figure I'd introduce myself properly." Yourself. Zaru's voice rose, a mixture of disbelief and outrage. The Cathar recognize only two things: dominance and prey. You should be dead. David gave Zephyr a gentle scratch beneath the jaw. The creature let out something that sounded eerily like a purr. "I don't know, counselor. Seems like he likes me." The silence in the chamber was suffocating. The sheer absurdity of the situation was almost too much for the Galactic Council to process. The Cathar were biological weapons. They had been engineered for combat and had participated in some of the bloodiest battles in galactic history. No civilization had ever befriended one. And yet, before their very eyes, A human had not only approached the beast, but had tamed it like a household pet. Zaru's growing panic. Counselor Zaru's panic deepened. His kind had spent centuries breeding and training the Cathar for war. They were prized for their loyalty only to the Zarn, their sheer lethality, and their unwavering obedience. If a Cathar could be won over so easily by a human, then what did that say about the Zarn's control over them? Zephyr, Zaru commanded, his voice thick with authority. Back. Return to your handler. Now. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, a Cathar disobeyed a direct command from a Zarn noble. Zephyr did not move. Instead, the beast leaned further into David's touch. Zaru's bioluminescence turned a pale, sickly blue, the color of existential dread. The other council members began murmuring among themselves, the realization of what had just happened sinking in. If humans could bond with the Cathar, if they could undo millennia of Zarn breeding, what else could they do? David's perspective. David was aware of the tension, but he chose to ignore it. His focus remained on Zephyr, on the way the beast responded to his presence. There was an intelligence in those piercing blue eyes, a sense of curiosity rather than malice. I think they've got it all wrong about you, buddy, David whispered. You're not a monster, are you? You're just misunderstood. Zephyr rumbled in agreement. The realization struck David like a bolt of lightning. These creatures weren't just war machines. They weren't mindless killers programmed for destruction. They had been taught to be that way. But if they could learn fear, then they could also learn trust. And that terrified the entire Galactic Council. The weight of what just happened. The murmuring in the chamber grew louder. Some council members looked intrigued, others visibly horrified. The implications of this moment were vast. If a human could tame the untamable, then what else were they capable of? Could humans disrupt centuries-old power structures just by being themselves? Had the Zarn, by revealing the true nature of the Cathar, just accidentally given humanity a weapon that no one had ever considered? Counselor Zaru's voice finally broke through the cacophony. This cannot be allowed. David raised an eyebrow. Why not? You don't understand what you've done, Zaru hissed. The Cathar are weapons, bred for war. If they start to think of humans as companions rather than warriors, then the entire balance of the galaxy shifts. David's smile widened. Maybe. That's exactly what needs to happen. A long pause followed. For the first time in galactic history, the unthinkable had occurred. A human had tamed the most feared predator in the universe, and the universe would never be the same again. A predator's loyalty and the Council's fear. The aftermath of David Harris' impossible act rippled through the grand chamber of the Galactic Council like a shockwave. The air was thick with stunned silence, a silence so deep it seemed to absorb the faint hum of the holographic displays and the whispers of energy coursing through the chamber walls. The delegates, hundreds of them, representing species from every known corner of the galaxy, sat frozen, their disbelief evident in their postures and the subtle shifts of their bioluminescent skin, twitching mandibles or flicking tails. A human had just bonded with a Cathar, the deadliest apex predator in the known universe. David, still crouched beside Zephyr, stroked the great beast's scaled head with an ease that bordered on casual. The once feared creature, bred for war and destruction, responded with an unmistakable rumbling purr that echoed across the chamber, sending a shudder through every being present. Across from him, Counselor Zaru, the Zarn diplomat and handler of Zephyr, stood paralyzed. His bioluminescent scales flickered erratically between deep crimson and pale blue, a sign of absolute horror. His claws dug into the podium, and his long, serpentine tail coiled in distress. This is impossible, Zaru muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Yet, the evidence was right before his eyes. Zephyr, a creature conditioned for generations to obey only the Zarn, had ignored a direct command from his handler. Not only that, but he had chosen to remain by the human side. The council reacts. A murmur spread through the chamber, growing into a roar as council members erupted into furious debate. This breaks every precedent we've ever had with the Cathar. The Zarn assured us these creatures were unbreakable. If humans can tame a Cathar, what else can they do? This could destabilize the entire balance of power. David, still kneeling next to Zephyr, smirked at the growing chaos. He wasn't an expert in intergalactic politics, but even he knew that something about this moment had completely shaken the power structure of the galaxy. A booming voice cut through the noise, bringing instant silence. Enough. Supreme Arbiter Veltrax, the highest-ranking authority of the Galactic Council, rose from his seat. He was an imposing figure, his elongated form wrapped in ceremonial robes lined with gold threads. His 3 luminous eyes locked onto David with a mixture of intrigue and unease. "Human," Veltrax said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Explain yourself." David stood, dusting off his uniform. "Not sure what needs explaining. I just said hello." He glanced at Zephyr, giving the massive creature another gentle pat. "And apparently, Zephyr here likes me." A collective shudder passed through the council at how easily David said the Cathar's name, as if they were old friends. Veltrax narrowed his gaze. "And how did you know it would respond positively?" David grinned. "I didn't." The silence that followed was suffocating. "You mean to tell us," Veltrax said, his voice carefully restrained, "that you approached the most dangerous predator in the galaxy, a creature known to rip beings apart for sport, without any certainty of survival?" David shrugged. "Seemed worth a shot." A nearby delegate choked on his own breath, his gill-like structures fluttering in shock. The chamber erupted again. They weren't just dealing with an unpredictable species. They were dealing with a species willing to take unimaginable risks. Zaru's fear grows. Counselor Zaru's hands trembled. "You don't understand," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "The Cathar are not mere beasts. They are creatures engineered for war, for conquest. Their bond with the Zarn is what keeps them under control. If that control is lost, if humans—" His words faltered, his fear making it difficult to continue. Veltrax turned toward Zaru. "What is it you fear, Counselor?" Zaru's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "If a Cathar willingly chooses a new bond," he said, his voice barely audible, "it cannot be undone." The words sent a visible ripple through the assembly. David raised an eyebrow. "Wait, what?" "The Cathar bond for life," Zaru snapped, regaining some of his composure. His yellow eyes locked onto David with an intensity bordering on desperation. "Once it acknowledges a master, that bond is unbreakable. Zephyr is no longer mine. He belongs to you." David blinked. "Huh." He turned to Zephyr. "Well, that's a surprise." Zephyr let out a low, pleased rumble. Zaru's fingers clenched into fists. His kind had spent centuries carefully managing the Cathar, ensuring their loyalty through rigorous training and bioengineered imprinting. But if humans, a species that hadn't even been part of the galactic community for more than a few decades, could bond with them naturally, then the entire Zarn military doctrine was in jeopardy. It was more than just an embarrassment. It was a catastrophe, the unraveling of a power structure. Veltrax exhaled slowly. "This changes things." Zaru whirled toward him. "We cannot allow this to continue. If the humans have the ability to bond with the Cathar, then what happens if they begin training them en masse?" The council members shuddered at the thought. A fleet of human-bonded Cathar, beasts who could tear apart warships with their claws, creatures immune to fear, fighting for a species known for its relentless persistence. It was a nightmare scenario for anyone who had ever considered humanity as harmless. David, watching the growing panic, finally sighed and crossed his arms. "You're all acting like I just unlocked some secret weapon." "I didn't." Veltrax raised an eyebrow. "Then explain why your species, out of every race in this galaxy, has accomplished something that none of us ever have." David scratched the back of his head. "I dunno. Maybe it's because we see things differently. Everyone else here looks at the Cathar and sees a monster. Something to control, something to fear. He nodded toward Zephyr. I just saw a creature that wanted to be understood. The weight of his words settled over the room like a thundercloud. Zaru's breathing quickened. This is unacceptable, he growled. The Zarn will not allow this blasphemy to stand. Veltrax's gaze darkened. And what would you propose, counselor? Zaru's lip curled. The human and the Cathar must be separated. Forcefully, if necessary. A low, warning growl filled the chamber. Every being turned toward Zephyr. The Cathar's stance had shifted. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Zaru with an intensity that froze him in place. The beast had not growled at the human. He had growled at his former handler. The message was clear. David was his chosen bond now, and nothing would change that. Zaru's confidence shattered. His bioluminescent scales flickered erratically in panic, his body trembling as Zephyr's deep growl rumbled across the chamber. Veltrax studied the exchange for a long moment before speaking. It seems, Counselor Zaru, the Supreme Arbiter said slowly, that this decision is no longer yours to make. For the first time in galactic history, the unthinkable had happened. A human had bonded with the deadliest predator in the universe, and there was nothing the Galactic Council could do to stop it. The predator, the human, and the war that follows. The Galactic Council had weathered countless political storms, interstellar conflicts, economic collapses, the rise and fall of empires, but nothing had shaken them quite like this. A human had bonded with a Cathar, the apex predator engineered by the Zarn. And worse, the Cathar had turned against its former handler. The moment Zephyr growled at Counselor Zaru, the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. A chill swept through the delegates as if an unseen force had slithered through their spines, whispering that something fundamental had shifted. The balance of power in the galaxy had just changed. David Harris, the human responsible for this nightmare, or miracle, depending on one's perspective, stood unfazed in the center of the council chamber. His posture was casual, hands in his pockets, but his mind was whirring. He could feel Zephyr at his side, a presence that was no longer just an ally, but something more. It wasn't just an animal's loyalty. It was absolute devotion, and every council member in the chamber could sense it. The Zarn's fear and desperation. Zaru was visibly unraveling, his luminescent scales flashing erratically in hues of yellow and deep violet, a sign of sheer panic. His claws clenched against the edges of his podium as he struggled to maintain composure. The Zarn Empire will not stand for this, he hissed. This is a violation of every precedent. Cathar do not bond with anyone but the Zarn. This is unnatural. It is a threat. David raised an eyebrow. Threat? He's just standing next to me. Zaru's tail lashed behind him. That thing could rip through warships with its claws. If humans have the ability to control them, we don't control them. David's voice was firm, his smirk gone. You all keep talking about the Cathar like they're weapons. Maybe that's why they don't trust you. He placed a hand on Zephyr's neck, feeling the warmth of the beast's powerful muscles beneath his scaled hide. This isn't about control. It's about trust. Maybe if you tried treating them as something more than attack dogs, they'd trust you too. The murmurs among the council grew louder. Zaru, his pride and power hanging by a thread, lashed out. This is an act of war. The words hit the chamber like a shockwave. Every delegate froze. The energy screens displaying the council's deliberations flickered. David frowned. Oh, come on. The Zarn have spent centuries perfecting the Cathar as weapons of war, ensuring their loyalty through our genetic imprinting and behavioral conditioning. Zaru continued, voice shaking but gaining volume. If the humans have found a way to override that control, then they have effectively stolen one of our greatest military assets. Veltrax, the Supreme Arbiter, raised a hand. You speak of war too quickly, Counselor. Zaru whirled toward him. Do I? If the humans can bond with the Cathar, what's stopping them from taming all of them? His voice dropped to a near whisper. What happens when the Zarn military, once unrivaled, is suddenly obsolete? The reality of that statement sank in like a cold dagger. Zarn warships were built around the Cathar. The war beasts acted as organic war engines, devastating entire planetary defenses. If they turned against their handlers, or worse, chose to fight for humans, it would mean the collapse of the Zarn Empire as the galaxy knew it. Veltrax considered this in silence. What if this is the first stage of a human invasion? We know so little about their species. What if they've done this before and hidden it from us? I always thought the humans were reckless, but what if they've been playing the long game? David clenched his jaw. He had seen this kind of paranoia before. It was like watching a bad sci-fi political drama unfold in real time. The fear of the unknown was louder than the truth. Veltrax exhaled slowly, his 3 glowing eyes closing for a moment. We cannot ignore the implications of this event, he finally said. Nor can we act out of impulse. The council must deliberate. The other delegates were beginning to murmur in fear rather than anger. Zaru slammed his clawed fist onto the podium. Deliberate what? The Zarn Empire will not wait while humans turn our war beasts against us. If the council does not act, the Zarn will. David's heart sank. This was bad. If the Zarn Empire declared war on humanity, it wouldn't be a minor skirmish. They had one of the most powerful navies in the galaxy, with billions of troops spread across thousands of worlds. And while humanity had their own tricks, they didn't have the numbers for a prolonged war against an empire built for conquest. Zephyr's warning. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the chamber. Zephyr had stepped forward, his eyes glowing like cold fire. The predator did not growl at David. He growled at the council. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, a primal, undeniable message that every species in the chamber understood instinctively. David's stomach twisted. Zephyr wasn't just bonded to him. He was protecting him. Zaru stiffened. Even now, you don't control it. No, David said softly, looking up at Zephyr. He's choosing to stand by me. Silence gripped the chamber once more. Veltrax steepled his fingers. This complicates matters. Zaru sneered. There is nothing complicated about it. This is war. David exhaled through his nose. He needed to stop this before it spiraled. You really want to start a war over this? David asked. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't think that'll work out in your favor. Zaru's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening us? David shook his head. No, I'm warning you. He crossed his arms and took a step closer to Zaru's podium. Zephyr matched his movement perfectly, his claws clicking against the floor. You think humans are weak because we've never been part of your wars, David continued. You think we avoid conflict because we're scared. But here's the thing, Counselor. We don't like unnecessary violence. That doesn't mean we're afraid of it. Zaru's throat clicked. David let his words sink in before finishing. Humanity isn't a race of conquerors, but when we fight, we win. And I promise you, his hand ran over Zephyr's powerful form, feeling the beast's raw strength beneath his fingers. If we fight with the Cathar at our side, we won't just win. We'll rewrite the rules of warfare. A long, heavy silence followed. Then Veltrax spoke. The council will convene immediately, the Supreme Arbiter declared. There will be no war, not until we understand the full consequences of what has transpired. Zaru bared his teeth but said nothing. David exhaled slowly. The storm wasn't over, but he had bought time. Time to figure out what the hell he had just started. And more importantly, what Zephyr's bond truly meant for humanity's future. When the apex predator chooses a side, the chamber doors slammed shut behind David, the echoes lingering in the high-domed hall as the Galactic Council erupted into frantic deliberation. The Supreme Arbiter had called for an immediate emergency session, and the weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. David could feel Zephyr tense beside him. The Cathar's powerful body coiled like a spring. The beast was no longer just an apex predator. He was a deciding factor in a potential galactic war. For centuries, the Zarn Empire had weaponized the Cathar, bending them to their will through biological imprinting and brutal conditioning. But Zephyr had done something no other Cathar had ever done before. He chose a human, and in doing so, he had shattered the illusion of the Zarn's absolute control. The battle of wills. David barely had time to process what had just happened before the security detail surrounded him. Tall, armor-clad enforcers of various species, their weapons lowered but their intent clear. They were here to ensure that the situation didn't spiral further. Veltrax, the supreme arbiter, rose from his throne-like seat and fixed David with an unreadable gaze. "Human," he said, his deep, resonating voice cutting through the noise. "You have altered the course of our deliberations in a way none of us expected." David forced a half smile. "I get that a lot." "This is not a matter of amusement." Veltrax's 3 glowing eyes narrowed. "The Zarn are on the verge of war. Their empire sees your bond with the Cathar as an existential threat." David exhaled sharply. Their empire sees anything they can't control as an existential threat. Zoru, the Zarn diplomat, bared his sharp teeth. "Do not pretend you are innocent in this, human. You have disrupted a sacred balance. You are playing with forces you do not understand." David raised an eyebrow. "Sacred balance? You mean enslaving an entire species to fight your wars?" Zoru's scales flushed dark blue in fury. The murmurs in the chamber grew louder. Some delegates were starting to agree with David. Veltrax raised a hand, silencing the room. "This is unprecedented," the Supreme Arbiter admitted. "A Cathar has willingly bonded with a human. It has rejected its genetic imprinting to the Zarn. If this is possible once, it is possible again." A chilling silence fell over the room. David realized what Veltrax was really saying. The Zarn's reign was crumbling. If Zephyr's bond with David was not an anomaly, then the entire Zarn war machine was at risk of falling apart. If other Cathar started choosing their own allies instead of blindly following orders, the Zarn Empire's greatest military advantage would become their greatest weakness. The Zarn's true fear. Zoru knew it too. David watched as the Zarn diplomat's furious expression shifted, not just to rage, but to panic. For centuries, the Zarn had been untouchable. Now, that illusion had been broken. This must be undone. Zoru hissed. The Cathar must be retrieved, and the human must be detained for duty. Zephyr let out a low, rumbling growl. A warning. Every council member flinched. Even the battle-hardened warriors among them. The Roth, the Drix, the Valine, reacted to the primal power of the sound. David didn't move, but his voice was steady. "I'd like to see you try." The chamber froze. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. Zoru's claws twitched. He was used to intimidation, used to being the most dangerous presence in the room. But not now. Not with Zephyr standing beside David, protecting him. A flicker of something dark crossed the Zarn's expression. David saw it. Realization. The Cathar weren't just war beasts. They were sentient. The Zarn had built their empire under the assumption that the Cathar were nothing more than highly intelligent weapons, creatures that obeyed orders but lacked true agency. But if that was wrong, if Zephyr was proof that Cathar could make their own choices, then everything the Zarn had built their empire on was a lie. And that was what scared them the most. A line is drawn. The council continued their deliberations. The political firestorm was just beginning, and war was still a very real possibility. David knew that. But right now, he had a bigger problem. He and Zephyr were no longer safe. The Zarn would never let this stand. Even if the council refused to go to war, Zoru would take matters into his own hands. Assassinations, kidnappings, biological countermeasures. They would try to separate them. And if that failed, it would try to kill them both. David glanced at Zephyr, whose massive form remained perfectly still, save for the slow, methodical flick of his tail. The Cathar had chosen him. Now, David had to make a choice too. He could try to talk his way out of this, convince the council to protect him and Zephyr. Or he could run. Disappear into the galaxy, go off the grid, and find out just how deep the truth about the Cathar went. Zephyr's glowing blue eyes met David's. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Understanding. David exhaled, clenching his fists. "Zephyr," he whispered, "I think it's time we left." The Cathar rumbled in agreement. And just like that, the most dangerous duo in the galaxy made their move.